construction site where trees were being felled to make way for a new bypass. She sat down on a felled tree and thereby prevented it from being cut up for removal.
Sam Miller has been charged with causing a breach of the peace while protesting against the cutting down of trees to make way for a bypass. She and her fellow protesters broke through a police cordon and sat on a tree playing panpipe music. The prosecution will say that she intimidated workers and ignored Garda requests to leave the area. The defence will deny this. They will claim that the protest was peaceful and that Sam Miller didn't hear the requests to leave. The judge will deal with issues of law. The jury will decide if Sam Miller is guilty or not guilty.
All rise. Silence in court.
Could the defendant please stand? Are you Sam Miller? You were charged with a breach of the peace in that on the first day of April 2002, in an area known as Calvin Grove, Hillside, you did conduct yourself in a disorderly manner and did commit a breach of the peace. How do you plead, guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
You may be seated. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, would you please stand and repeat after me? I will faithfully try the defendant. And give a true verdict according to the evidence. You may be seated.
May it please your lordships, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I appear for the prosecution with my learned colleague, Mr. Towers. My name is Mr. Radhakrishnan, and my learned friends, Miss Egan's and Miss Blackwell, represent the defendant. Now, the accused, Miss Sam Miller, is charged with the breach of the peace. She was an anti-road protester at a construction site where trees were being felled to make way for a new bypass. She sat down on a felled tree and thereby prevented it from being cut up for removal. It is the prosecution's case that she refused to move when requested to do so by the Garda, and that she eventually had to be physically removed from the site. It is the defence's case that Miss Miller was not given any requests to move, or that if she was, she did not hear it because of noise on the site. The prosecution will demonstrate that this was a protest which became violent. The prosecution will show you that Miss Miller was a leader of this demonstration and was inciting violence among her fellow protesters. The prosecution will show you that by sitting on the felled tree, she prevented the contractors from doing their work. And the prosecution will also show you that Miss Miller made no attempts whatsoever to cooperate with the Garda. All these charges add up to a breach of the peace, ladies and gentlemen. May I remind this court of law that a breach of the peace consists of any act likely to cause reasonable alarm or apprehension to any members of the public. There is no doubt whatsoever that Miss Miller's actions caused reasonable, if not even excessive alarm to the contractors who were working on the site and whose sole concern was for safety. The defendant's sole intention was to disrupt work. She breached the security of the site, and her presence and that of her fellow protesters was a safety hazard. She also failed to take into account the circumstances in which the bypass was being built in this area, and she was being totally unreasonable. The defence's ill-informed claim that Miss Miller couldn't hear requests because of noise on the site is simply trying to gloss over the fact that she abused her right to peaceful protest, and in doing so, she committed a breach of the peace. The defendant's refusal to move could have had extremely severe consequences. The presence of a large amount of dangerous equipment on the site was ignored by the protesters in their overzealous and irresponsible attempts to protest. There could have been many tragedies if it wasn't for the excellent handling of the situation by the Garda. The burden of proof lies on the prosecution, and we will show you beyond all reasonable doubt that the defendant is indeed guilty of a breach of the peace. And on that note, the prosecution would like to call its first witness, Garda Alex Keane. Thank you, Your Lordships.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You may be seated.
Could you please state your name for the court?
My name is Garda Alex Keane.
And how long have you been a guard?
Well, 13 years now.
13 years. That's a lot of experience. Now, could you please describe in your own words, the events that took place leading up to the arrest of the defendant?
Well, myself and my partner, Garda recruit Vic Brightspark, were on uniform police duty, supervising a demonstration in Kelvin Grove against the bypass.
And how many protesters were at this demonstration?
In excess of 50.
In excess of 50, that's quite a lot. How were they conducting themselves?
They were making quite a nuisance of themselves. They were chaining themselves to trees, equipment. They were charging and shouting towards the police.
And whose safety did you feel they were endangering?
Well, most importantly, their own, and also the contractors and Garda who were working around them.
And what steps were taken to control these protesters?
Well, we removed them from some of the trees for their own safety, and we set up a police barrier to prevent them from gaining access to where they could cause themselves the most harm.
How successful was this police barrier?
Not at all. They broke right through it, which to my knowledge is a breach of the peace.
My lords, at this point I would like to submit an item. It is police tape, and I would like the witness to recognize the police tape, and it's similar to the one used on site. Mr. Keane, could you please recognize the following piece of tape?
That's the piece of Garda tape that is the exact same as the one that we used on site that day.
Thank you, Mr. Keane. And what happened after you set up the police barrier?
Well, like I said, it was broken down, and so we followed them into the site, and we came across the defendant, whom I now know to be Miss Sam Miller, who was sitting across a tree trunk playing some sort of instrument with her back turned to the contractor, Georgie Washington.
And how did you approach the situation?
With an open mind, we were concerned for the safety of the defendant. We were concerned for the safety of the contractors. We know it only takes one person to turn a peaceful protest into an angry mob.
And how did you prevent the situation escalating into violence?
We attempted to contact the defendant. We asked that she remove herself from the tree. I moved in closer. I made eye contact. I came up to her and spoke to her quite clearly, and I asked her that she remove herself.
And what were Mr. Miller's reactions to your requests?
Well, Miss Miller blatantly ignored me.
And how far away from the defendant were you?
When I first made requests, about 3 meters, and when I second made requests, I came up right close to her face.
And at the time of arrest, what was his demeanor?
Her demeanor was quite arrogant. She said, "I could not hear you because of the chainsaw," which I believe to be completely ludicrous.
Completely ludicrous. Thank you, Mr. Garda Keane. My lords, I have no further questions.
Garda Keane, you say you have 13 years' experience, is that correct?
It is.
And had you been on many protests before?
I had been on a few, yes.
And was it yourself and Garda Brightspark that was on duty that day?
Yes, along with 2 others.
And was there many demonstrators?
Over 50.
And you dealt with it yourself, you did?
We did, yes.
And you felt you had enough experience to do this?
I did, yes.
How many contractors was there?
I'd say within 20 or 30.
And were they all working away?
A lot of them were, yes.
With their equipment?
Before the protesters broke through the police barrier, they were, yes.
But they were working away, so that naturally implies they were working with their equipment, correct, Garda Keane?
Yes.
And that equipment included chainsaws?
It did, yes.
So there was lots of noise in the area, I suppose?
There was, but
There
once
was
the
a lot of
protesters broke through the barrier, I believe that the contractors ceased all work for their own safety.
But the question I'm asking you, Garda Keane, is that you acknowledge that there was a lot of noise in the area at the time.
There was some, yes.
So, in your opinion, Garda Keane, was Miss Miller causing a breach of the peace?
Yes, she was.
And how would you define a breach of the peace, Garda Keane?
I would define it as someone who is making a nuisance of themselves, someone who is causing alarm to other members of society.
And when you say you're of the opinion that she was causing a breach of the peace, how did you form this opinion, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, she was ignoring our requests to remove herself from a site that she did not have permission to be at in the first place. Herself and her group broke through a police barrier, which is a breach of the peace, a number of other things.
So you formed this opinion because of what you saw yourself or because of what Miss Washington told you?
No, I formed the opinion by what I saw myself.
And the breach of the peace that's in question here today is that she sat on the felled tree. What do you say to that, rather than breaking through the police cordon?
She was preventing someone from continuing with their work and possibly escalating a situation into violence.
How do you think she was escalating the situation?
Well, she was playing the
further?
instrument. I think it was a panpipe, and
That's correct.
the protesters were dancing around her. And for their own safety, there is equipment around that is potentially dangerous, and they were dancing with no responsibility whatsoever.
Garda Keane, how did you indicate to the accused that she was going to be arrested?
I told her verbally, and I came up to her close, and I said into her ear that she would be arrested for breach of the peace if she did not remove herself immediately.
And did you at any stage put your hand in her prior to when you arrested her?
No, I did not.
Did you ever at any stage, Garda Keane, receive any indication directly from Miss Miller that she had heard you?
She looked at me
When did she look at you, Garda Keane?
when I was speaking to her.
And did you receive any confirmation from that she had heard you?
Verbal confirmation?
Any confirmation, Garda Keane?
Besides her looking at me, no.
And what about the noise level in the area at the time?
I believe the contractor had a chainsaw on idle.
I put it to you, Garda Keane, that besides from the fact that you believed you were standing in front of her and she couldn't have missed you, that Miss Miller did not in fact hear you at all. She made no contact with you whatsoever. She gave you no acknowledgement that she had actually in fact heard you.
Looking at someone is acknowledgement.
Is that opinion, Garda Keane?
No, that's fact.
But with Miss Miller, you will hear in her evidence that she believes she didn't hear you at all, Garda Keane.
Obviously, she would disagree with the statement, otherwise she wouldn't be here today in court.
But then obviously, Garda Keane, you will disagree with what Miss Miller is going to say because you were here on behalf of the prosecution. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
So, is it correct to say at the time you did not know Miss Miller's name?
No, I didn't know Miss Miller's name at the time.
So, when you addressed her, you didn't address her by her first name?
No.
So naturally, you could have been talking to anyone, Garda Keane.
I was
Isn't that
looking
correct?
directly at her, and I came up close to her face.
Close to her face, but you still did not address her by her name. So, as far as Miss Miller is concerned, you could have been talking to anyone, Garda Keane.
I disagree.
That's good. Thank you, Garda Keane.
Do you wish to re-examine in any way?
Not at all, Your Lordship, thank you.
Very good.
Your Lordships, the prosecution would like to call the second witness, Mr. Georgie Washington.
Very good.
Can you state your name and occupation for the court, please?
My name is Georgie Washington, and I'm a lumberjack.
And how long have you been a lumberjack, Mr. Washington?
Approximately 20 years.
That's a lot of experience. Can you tell us, what qualifications do you have?
Well, I spent a year at a course in DCU on machine operation, which qualifies me as, I suppose, a tree surgeon.
I see. So can you tell us, what were you doing on the 1st of April 2002?
I was working as I usually do on the site, cutting down trees.
And what was unusual about this day?
There was a protest on that day.
How many protesters were there?
There was a few dozen.
A few dozen. And what actions were these protesters taking?
Well, in the beginning they were chanting from outside the barrier that the police had put up, but then they broke through it and started dancing around aggressively.
I see. So what effect did their presence on site have on your work?
Well, we had to stop working for safety reasons.
And can you list some of the safety precautions you take on site?
Well, we have helmets, visors, gloves, we have hard boots, and we have harnesses as well.
I see. And can you tell the court what precautions were the protesters taking?
And they're taking absolutely no precautions.
Absolutely no precautions at all. So where did you first find the defendant?
I first found the defendant when she proceeded to sit on a log which I was trying to cut into smaller pieces.
And what was she doing?
She was playing the panpipes.
And what effect was the music from these panpipes having on any nearby protesters?
It was inciting them to become aggressive.
And what were the other protesters doing?
They began jumping around more aggressively.
I see. So what did you do, Mr. Washington?
Well, I asked her to leave the area so we could continue with our work.
And what was her response?
She completely ignored me.
She completely ignored you. So what did you do since she was obviously impeding your work, Mr. Washington?
Well, I called for the Garda to come intervene.
And what communication did the Gardaí have with Miss Miller?
They approached her, they called out to her, they told her what the situation was, and if she didn't move herself, she would be charged. And then when that at first did not succeed, they moved even closer.
Can I just interrupt you there? How close were they the second time?
They went right up beside her and spoke directly into her ear.
I see. And please continue. What were they doing?
Afterwards, after the second attempt, when they got no reply, they decided that it was necessary to arrest her.
I see. So can you describe noise levels on site at the time of communication?
The noise levels were minimal.
They were minimal. So what is the likelihood that the defendant couldn't hear requests from Ms. Garda Keane?
It's very, very unlikely that she couldn't hear the requests.
It's very, very unlikely, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Washington. No further questions, Your Lordships.
Do you wish to cross-examine?
My lordships. Mr. Washington, do you like your job?
I do.
So, and how long did you say you've been in the business for?
20 years.
So you must have dealt with many protests then.
Yes, a few.
Okay, and could you tell me, how do you feel about demonstrations?
I have no problem with demonstrations once they're peaceful.
And how do you feel about protesters?
Same, once they're peaceful, I have absolutely no problem with them.
But this particular protester was grubby, wasn't he?
He was only grubby like myself.
And could you tell me, how many protesters were there?
There was a few dozen.
And what were they doing?
Well, initially they were just chanting outside, but as soon as they broke through the barrier, they were causing a nuisance on the site.
So they broke the barrier and were causing a nuisance. So you were upset by this? You couldn't do your job?
Well, I wouldn't use the word upset, but yes, I was troubled by it.
Yeah, you were annoyed.
No, not really annoyed.
So how did you feel?
Well, I wasn't very, there's not an emotion to describe it. They came on the site and they, obviously stopped us from working, so it was a bit of a break for me.
It was a break for you that they stopped you working, so you should have been glad. Then why did you call the Garda?
Well, because it is trespassing and it is dangerous, and being a contractor in that area, I would be partially responsible if anything would happen to them.
I put it to you, Mr. Washington, that you were annoyed by these troublemakers. They interrupted your work. You couldn't do your job anymore. You were frustrated.
No, it's not true. I get paid for the hour, not for the tree.
So how many contractors were on the site? 20 to 30 approximately?
Approximately.
And how many protesters?
There was a few dozen.
And what were they doing?
Who? The
Protesters.
Protesters, at what stage? Before they had broken the barrier or not?
Before they'd broken into the barrier.
They were just protesting, chaining themselves to
protesting,
trees.
shouting and screaming and
Chaining themselves to trees.
getting their point across. Correct?
Yeah.
So you approached Mr. Miller, is that correct?
Yes, I approached Miss Miller.
And what did you say to her?
I asked her to remove herself.
And what position was she on the tree?
She was sitting astride the tree.
So her back was towards you?
Yes, but I moved around the tree.
So
I
her
was
back was
facing.
towards you when you approached her. And what did you say to her?
I asked her to move off the tree.
And how many times did you ask her this question?
2 to 3 times.
So you had to communicate with her 2 to 3 times?
Yes, well, I was ignored on all occasions, so...
Well, I put it to you, Mr. Washington, that communication is not effective when there are about 50 protesters shouting and screaming, 20 to 30 contractors with idling chainsaws, but idling chainsaws still make noise. There were Garda on the scene trying to control the situation. Communication is the transfer of information from one person to another. For it to be successful, it must be clearly transmitted. It must be received and analysed, understood and then acted upon. How could Miss Miller have heard you when the communication was not clear? There were people shouting and screaming, 50 of them, 20 to 30 contractors.
Would you allow the witness answer a question?
Sorry.
Okay. Well, first of all, Miss Miller was one of the first on the site. She sat in the tree, so there was only a few protesters at that stage in the immediate area. I was the only contractor with a running chainsaw at that stage, and there was virtually no other machinery in the area, so sound levels were very low.
So, but yes, you had to communicate with her a couple of times, so obviously communication was not clear.
It wasn't that she couldn't hear me, it was that she chose to ignore me.
And how do you know she couldn't hear you? Did she react? Did she respond? Any